The next element I want to talk about here is the Battle of Midway. And the Battle of Midway we're going to discuss in a way that you probably have never heard about before. If you have, probably not in a lot of great detail. So I'm going to talk about 4 ships and their role in doing the replenishment, repair, reinforcements, and replacements. 3 of them are featured here in this video. So first part here, replenishment. So down below you see the USS Kaloli. Now that is not Kaloli in its naval guise. It's actually post-World War II when it was outfitted for commercial service. She is an AOG. That means a small gasoline tanker. Kaloli is going to be important because Kaloli is going to come into Midway to replenish the Midway fuel stores. And we're going to talk about why that is so crucial here in a few moments. When it comes to repair, everybody knows the story about USS Yorktown being damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea and coming up and sitting in dry dock number 1 before heading out for the Battle of Midway. What many people don't know is USS Vireo, that was a minesweeper, was redesignated just short of the battle into a tug, AT-144. And Vireo is going to be out there to help in the salvage and repair of any damaged vessel. It's going to play a very important role, matter of fact, in the attempted repair for USS Yorktown. And then when we talk about reinforcements, there are 2 really vessels that play a big role in reinforcements. One of them is a cruiser, the USS Nashville. Nashville is going to sail into Midway just before it heads up to Alaska as part of Task Force 8. And it's going to drop off 2 companies of Marine raiders. Those raiders are going to reinforce the islands to provide a striking force on both Eastern and Sand Island, the 2 islands that make up Midway Atoll, so that if the Japanese are able to land on the island, they will be able to resist that. But probably the ship that's probably the most significant is USS Kitty Hawk, a ship we're going to talk about later here. Kitty Hawk is a modified sea train cargo vessel. It was designed to carry fully loaded trains. Kitty Hawk arrives at Midway and offloads aircraft reinforcements, specifically F-4F Wildcats and SBD Dauntless dive bombers, to reinforce the air group that is located at Midway. The other reinforcement will come from the U.S. Army Air Forces. B-26s are going to be set up, but most significantly B-17 Flying Fortresses. Again, we're going to come back to that. The other vessel we're going to talk about is subsequently coming up here, and that's going to be USS Saratoga, a carrier not usually identified with the Battle of Midway. So Battle of Midway, I'm not going to go through the full Battle of Midway because there are plenty of books on that. I cannot do any justice to the Battle of Midway that John Parshall and Tony Tully did in Shattered Sword, or any of the latest iterations that have come out since then. However, I will note that I'm going to cover an aspect of the battle that almost never gets discussed. And again, it goes back to our 4 R's. Depicted there is Yorktown under attack, and then on the right there is Admiral Fletcher and Admiral Spruance, the commanders of the 2 task forces. Admiral Fletcher commanded Task Force 17 with the Yorktown. Admiral Spruance commanded Task Force 16, which was the Enterprise and Hornet. A lot of questions about Spruance taking command. I got to say, Fletcher was a cruiser division commander. Matter of fact, Spruance relieved him as cruiser division commander. So not really a big surprise that Spruance takes over in this battle. So a couple of things to note. So on May 28th, Task Force 16 departs Pearl Harbor. This is the Enterprise and Hornet. On May 30th, Task Force 17, this is Yorktown, will depart Pearl Harbor. On May 31st, the Enterprise refuel from 2 oilers that are off the coast of Midway. Now, there are going to be 3 fast oilers in and around the region of Midway. There's going to be a 4th at Pearl Harbor. The 5th is up in Alaska. The 6th one, the Osho, had been sunk. So on May 31st, Task Force 16 will refuel. Notice the date, May 31st. Over June 1st and 2nd, Yorktown will refuel. Fletcher does not refuel until the last moment. He knows that he can expect to see the Japanese arrive either on June 3rd or June 4th. He waits until the last moment to refuel. I again think this is Fletcher learning from his issues with refueling over the course of many months. He, during the Battle of Coral Sea, will be very hard on Admiral Fitch, who commands the Lexington Task Force. Fitch had relieved Brown on the Lexington. Fitch actually takes too long to refuel, doesn't refuel soon enough, and more importantly, during the Battle of Coral Sea, Fletcher will lose his fast oiler, the Neosho, really crippling his force. So you have the Battle of Midway on June 4th and 6th. We're going to skip over that because that's not the point we're looking at here. On June 6th, Task Force 16, commander of Desron 1, reports fuel on board his destroyers for 12 hours at 25 knots and 40 hours at 15 knots. One of the orders sent to Spruance was to cut his destroyers loose and execute a torpedo attack against the fleeing elements of the Japanese fleet, but he refueled May 31st. It is now 7 days later, and his carriers have been running around at 25 knots, and while the carriers and cruisers had fuel, the destroyers did not. So much so that he realizes he can't order his destroyers out. He's at a critical fuel shortage. Matter of fact, that is the bulk of his destroyers. There's actually a destroyer that's in a worse position than this. But at the same time, Task Force 17 will refuel from Plot. Now, at this point, Yorktown has been damaged. It is under salvage at this moment. Fletcher is concerned that he has to keep his task force fueled in case there is a subsequent engagement. Remember, not everybody knows the battle is over at this point. On June 7th, Guadalupe, this is the third oiler that is sent up to the region around Midway, is going to transfer fuel to Kaloli. This is because Midway is critically short on fuel. Midway is operating an entire carrier air group basically out of Midway. And Midway is consuming fuel at an alarming rate. And one of the reasons it's consuming fuel at an alarming rate is half of its fuel supply, 375,000 gallons in 16 out of the 31 tanks, was destroyed on 22 May because of an inadvertent detonation of explosives. They were hooking up explosives to the tanks so that if the Japanese invaded, they could destroy them. Well, while hooking them up, they inadvertently exploded half the tanks. So they had rushed fuel to Midway to replace portions of that, but not all of it. But because of the number of airstrikes being launched, particularly with the B-17s and the PBYs that are in the area, they've got to get fuel up there. So Guadalupe, they don't want to bring Guadalupe into Midway because it's too high value. So they transfer fuel over to Kaloli, and Kaloli is going to run into Midway to replenish Midway. On June 8th and 9th, finally, Spruance is going to refuel from Cimarron and Guadalupe. Plot and Cimarron had basically dumped more than half their fuel. Plot consolidated its fuel into Cimarron, and Plot ran back to Pearl Harbor. So finally, Task Force 16 will refuel. Notice it had not refueled since May 31st. It had been out for almost 10 days before refueling. On June 10th, Task Force 16 was going to rendezvous with Saratoga and Kaskaskia. Now, Task Force 16 at this point does not have Yorktown. Yorktown was sunk on June 7th by an attack from I-168 that sinks both Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond. But in the meantime, Fletcher on board Astoria raced out to meet Saratoga coming from the west coast. He was going to take command. Remember, Fletcher is in overall command of the strike group. And one of the things that he was doing was heading east to go meet Saratoga, get on board Saratoga, bring Saratoga up. And what he wants to do is replenish Enterprise and Yorktown, as we're going to talk about here. And then on June 11th, Saratoga is going to transfer aircraft from Enterprise to Hornet. This image here, which is a drawing actually, shows that moment when Yorktown and Hammond are hit by I-168. It's actually after the torpedo strike. This is Hammond blowing up when she sinks and her depth charge is going off. You'll see off the bow of Yorktown here, Vireo has cut her tow line. She's actually circling back here, heading over to Yorktown. One of the big lessons comes out of the Battle of Midway was how crucial it was to have salvage efforts and salvage equipment close by. Vireo was there to provide the tow. It freed up the cruisers. Initially, they were using a heavy cruiser to do it, but they'd much rather use a fleet tug with its horsepower and, more importantly, its expendability than to tie up a heavy cruiser. The Saratoga, in the meantime, Task Force 11 arrives into the area. Now, Saratoga had rushed from the West Coast. It had undergone an extensive repair. It had been torpedoed in January of 1942. It also lost its 8-inch deck guns, replaced by 5-inch 38s, kind of really the template that you'll see on the Essex-class carriers later. But the other thing on Saratoga was her flight deck was beefed up, particularly her arresting gear. If you look at her air group she comes out with, she has 107 planes in one of the most strangest air groups ever created. It is a composite air group made up of 3 fighter squadrons, 2 scouting squadrons, 2 torpedo squadrons, along with some SBDs being ferried out. If you look at her torpedo planes, they're a mix of Devastators and Avengers. She will rendezvous with Task Force 16 and transfer over parts of her air group. So to Hornet goes 9 Dauntlesses and 10 TBF Avengers. Hornet, since it was the newest aircraft carrier in the fleet, had already been upgraded. It had the new arresting gear so it could handle the Avengers. Enterprise gets 10 Dauntlesses. It gets the 5 Devastators, because they cannot handle Avengers yet. During the period after Pearl Harbor up to the Battle of Guadalcanal, Enterprise is going to be taken in hand, and she is going to be updated. Then Saratoga heads back to Pearl Harbor and picks up her air group. She was actually coming out ferrying aircraft. So the group on board Saratoga was not designed to go into battle. Instead, what she was doing was ferrying. The Saratoga air group had been left in Pearl Harbor. Matter of fact, part of it was on board Yorktown. She reloads her air group, plus takes on board 2 squadrons to ferry out to Midway. The Midway Air Group, especially the single-engine planes of the Marine Air Group, had been decimated. So she brings out a scouting bombing squadron, VMSB 231, and a fighter squadron, an Army fighter squadron, the 73rd Fighter Squadron, made up of 25 P-40s. Now, there was a plan to bring Army fighters out to Midway before that, but the reason it wasn't done was because once you fly off those P-40s on the Midway, they're stuck. You can't get them off. They can't fly back. Now, subsequently, the U.S. is going to develop a series of landing strips between Midway and Hawaii so that you can ferry the aircraft. But right now, because there's not a Marine air group or a Marine fighter group that can go out to Midway, they decide to send the P-40s out there. So when we talk about the 4 R's, Midway has got all of them. We got replenishment, and we've got issues with replenishment during the battles. Spruance is actually the one who seems to have the biggest issue regarding that. Repair, we've got Vireo out there. We had Yorktown going into dry dock number 1 for repairs, so that repair plays an absolutely essential role. We got reinforcements. We had the reinforcement with aircraft out to Midway with the Marine Raider Group to make Midway as kind of impenetrable as possible, or at least as fortified as possible, should the Japanese land. A lot of discussion about even if the Japanese had landed on Midway, would they have been able to take it? I don't think so. I don't think the Army group they had on there was going to take Midway. And then finally, the replacements. The role of Saratoga, I think, is really important because one of the things it does is it rebuilds the air groups on Enterprise and Hornet so that Enterprise and Hornet can head north to help counter the invasion of the Aleutians. Now, that has turned around very quickly. Enterprise and Hornet under Spruance are ordered back to Pearl Harbor because what's happening here now is that the decision is going to be made that, listen, we can afford to lose the Aleutian Islands, the very western part of the Aleutians, but what we need to do is consolidate our striking groups back and plan for an offensive that's going to happen down at Guadalcanal.